Have you ever wondered what makes somebody so obsessed about equity in human milk feeding that they devote their whole lives to the concept? They change from a thriving career in education to a 9-year journey to becoming an internationally board certified lactation consultant and a podcast host devoted to the struggles and triumphs of baby feeding through the lens of systemic and cultural barriers. Well, today, I will share my own personal journey of breastfeeding my 2 kids. And I recruited a special guest host to help me do that. So let's get into it.
When I began breastfeeding, I was blindsided by how difficult it was. I may have thought I was prepared, but having known only a handful of people who had ever breastfed and only seeing it up close from a couple of them, I had a huge learning curve. Since then, I've become a doula, a lactation consultant, and a childbirth educator. I'm your host, Lo Nigrosh, and I welcome you to the Milk Making Minutes, where we explore breastfeeding experiences through the lens of systemic barriers, so that you know your breastfeeding struggles are not your fault, and your triumphs really are the miracles you feel they are.
Welcome to the 100th episode of Milk Making Minutes. Surprise! This is not Lo speaking. This is guest host Chelsea B. from Beyond the Picket Fence. Lo has been so nice to invite me on to be the host, to ask her the questions and turn the mic on her. So welcome the 100th episode guest, the amazing Lo Nigrosh. How are you, Lo?
I'm so good. Thank you, Chelsea. Thank you so much.
I'm so excited to be here to have you on your own show. This is going to be so great. You had me on a while back and I didn't even realize everything that I didn't know about breastfeeding. So I'm so grateful for what you're doing. First of all, this podcast is amazing for so many women for so many reasons. And I'm excited to hear your story.
Yeah, your show is still one of my all-time favorites, and I'll link it in the show notes because it was an incredible story.
Oh, you're so sweet. And Lo told her story, not her breast milk story on my show. So we're not really going to get into that this time. We are going to have you tell your own story. And one of my favorite things that you ask, when I remember you asked me, and the few episodes I've listened to, you always ask this question: what was your exposure to breastfeeding before you were pregnant and making decisions about feeding your baby?
Yeah, very little. I had no exposure growing up. If I think about my childhood, I don't think I ever saw somebody feeding a baby from their body at all.
Really?
Yeah, as a child, no.
Remind me where you fall in your order of siblings, or do you have siblings?
Yes, I am the middle child. There's a 3-year difference between each of us. I was really little when my mom had my little brother, who's almost exactly 3 years younger than me. And she did try to breastfeed each of us, I believe, but did not breastfeed for that long for any of us. And so I have no memories of that. And then I babysat and always fed formula in bottles. So that was the norm when I babysat. And then I was a nanny for 3 years to a little girl. I started when she was 3 months old, and I ended when she was 3 years old. And she did breastfeed, but she did also a combo. So some breastfeeding, some formula feeding. And so I did feed breast milk in a bottle to that baby. And the mom worked from home. And I remember pumping being difficult, and I remember supply being difficult for her. But at that time, I literally knew nothing about human milk feeding. And so I just thought supply issues, that was normal. I didn't think anything of it. And she weaned early, like before 1 year old. She weaned, and I remember the mom saying, yeah, she's just not interested anymore. Knowing what I know now, I know that if a child is weaning from the breast early, there's a reason for that. And it probably has to do with low milk supply and people don't typically have low milk supply for no reason. But at the time, I was just like, "Okay." Yeah, and of course, that was my role as a nanny. Your role isn't to question what is
Yeah.
happening between the mom and the baby anyway. It was she didn't want my milk feeding
Expertise.
opinions.
Good
Right.
for you.
Yeah. So, of course, I was just, "You want me to feed formula these feeds? Sure, I'll feed formula these feeds. You want me to feed your breast milk these feeds? I'll feed your breast milk these feeds." I was just doing what I was being asked to do, which was exactly my role at that time.
Yes, and how
And
old were you?
I was in my early 20s.
Okay, so
Yeah.
pretty old.
Yeah.
I
And
mean,
my
like, old enough
sis
to understand, not like a 14-year-old. There's a
Right.
different mentality in those ages.
Yes. Yes, exactly. And then my sister I did also interview my sister on my show, and she shared her story. So she has 3 biological children and 3 adopted children. And so she was one of the very first people that I saw breastfeeding, my first influence. And she really struggled the first time, but is one of the most determined people I know. And she was basically just like, "This is happening." And she was a nurse, and so I just thought she knew everything because she was a nurse. And so I saw her struggle, but I also saw her persevere, and then she got her stride. But because she was a nurse, she was pretty open about just showing me her breasts, and I remember seeing her breasts one time, and they were gnarly, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, that looks awful."
What do you mean
And,
by that? Do you mean as in, like, nipple damage from the suckling or, like, they were engorged or what?
they were
What do you mean by
infected.
gnarly?
They were really infected. Her nipples were really infected.
Ouch.
Yeah, with her first. And I remember being like, since then, as a lactation professional, I have seen all sorts of damaged nipples and infected nipples, and I've seen it all. But at the time, I had seen very few nipples. People don't usually go around showing each other their nipples, at least in the environments I had grown up in. And I just remember being astounded. But I was grateful to her that she was so open and like, "Yeah, this is what I'm going through right now." And I had a cousin who I'm still close with today. She was my very first interview on the Milk Making Minutes, actually, Danielle, and she came to my wedding. I had a very small wedding, only about 20 guests,
Wow.
and she was still pumping at the time. And so I got to see her pump, which was cool. And then when I was pregnant, I took a very long birth education class. I teased that we were high achievers. It was like 12 weeks of birth education, 2
Ooh.
hours a week. And the instructor, she was nursing a toddler. And I actually just recently, maybe about 10 episodes ago, I interviewed her, and I have not been in touch with her since we took the class. So that was
Mm.
neat because that was almost 9 years ago. And she's since become a midwife. And she was probably the person who changed the course of my baby feeding life, I would say. Because as I was pregnant, I was watching her feed this toddler, and this toddler would come up to her, nurse, run off, come up to her, nurse, run off. And it normalized toddler feeding for me in this way that I had just never seen before. So most of the time when I had seen breastfeeding, it was always like under a cover, unless it was my sister and we were in her house and there was nobody else around. And so it just opened the door to me for normalizing breastfeeding in a way that it had never been done for me before. And that kind of changed the trajectory of my life. I didn't know it at the time.
That's amazing. So
Yeah.
your first thoughts was with your sisters, who your first initial exposure was. Do you remember your first thought? Did you ever have a thought of, I can't wait to do this? Or like there's no way I'm doing that? Do you remember any type of strong feeling?
Yeah, so I knew when I was pregnant that I was going to breastfeed. It was really important to me. I was playing around with the idea of home birth, but my husband wasn't that comfortable. I then got diagnosed with gestational diabetes, and So I was higher risk. And so I thought maybe I will have a home birth if I ever have another child, which I did end up for my second child having a home birth. But I thought, okay, I'm going to have a hospital birth with midwifery care. And I read breastfeeding books and I asked a lot of questions about baby feeding to everyone I could. And I knew I was going to breastfeed. It was really important to me, even in pregnancy. And my husband, and since then, actually, I'm just gonna have to link all these episodes. I just actually had a
I know
conversation
you
with
have so many
him.
good ones. I'm
I
like,
know.
"Ooh, I can't wait to go back and listen."
I just had a conversation with him for Valentine's Day, and he said he did not recognize in pregnancy how determined I was to breastfeed. He knew I wanted to do it, but he did not know at the time how important it was to me. But I had a
So,
sense.
yeah, which had ignited when you went to that birth class.
Yeah. Yeah. And I
That's
can't
really
even
cool.
name why. I can't name why. Um, because there's a term, I don't know if you've ever heard it, lactivist, which is like a lactation activist put together. But it can have some negative connotations because if you're a lactivist, it means that you are anti formula, which I am not a lactivist.
Mm.
I don't identify as that because I feel like we are not supported enough to ensure that all people can feed human milk to their babies. And I don't want anyone to ever feel guilty for whatever choices they make to feed their babies. But for whatever reason, I felt very strongly about feeding my babies breast milk.
Which is really cool because I think my sister is a hairstylist, and I remember her telling me a story of one of her toddlers, which she said was like, as the story gets told over and over, it's like this 9-year-old came and sucked out of his mom's breast. I feel like that was one thing that was like, I will never do that. That's a strong reaction. Either you have a strong reaction not doing that, super weird, but you had the opposite reaction of that is beautiful, that is amazing, and it ignited something inside of you, which so grateful it did because now look where you're at. That's amazing.
Yeah, I could just see the connection they had with each other. I could see how responsive it helped her be to her child.
So did you have a I know people have birth plans, right? Did
Mhm.
you have a breastfeeding plan?
So I knew that I wanted to breastfeed for as long as my baby wanted to breastfeed. I wasn't thinking that I was going to wean at a year. I wanted my toddler to self wean.
And did that happen?
Yes, for both of my kids.
Wow.
Um,
Okay. Can you tell
yeah.
me more about what that looks like for people who didn't? Both my kids, I told my story of my second son on your show, but my first daughter, I think I only lasted like a year and a little bit because she bit me and then I was like, I'm done.
I remember you
So
saying that. Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
I have a lot of people who say, as soon as my children have teeth, there's no way. And that is totally an appropriate feeling to have for parents. And
Yes, but it's
I
not the feeling you had. So can you, without worrying about everyone else's feelings, tell me how your experience went?
Yeah, my son actually was very challenging, but I did nurse him for a little over 3 years. And my daughter, who is almost 5 and a half, I nursed her until she was almost 5.
You like
And
recently stopped.
yes, recently stopped. And I was really ready to be done nursing her, and I encouraged that one a little bit. But she was almost 5. So, yeah, I would still say I met that goal of
Yeah, absolutely. 5 is
yeah.
that's outlandish in my brain. That's
Right, yeah,
amazing. So when
yeah.
you said your son was a little bit more difficult, what was
S
difficult?
Yeah, I was in severe pain with him for the entire 3.5 years. And I'm always hesitant to tell people that because people think, "Are you nuts? Like, why would you put yourself through that?" And I don't ever expect anybody else to put themselves through that, and I always ask people who are in pain, "What do you want to do? Would it be better for you and for your own mental health and for your own physical well-being to stop? Or would it be better for you to keep trying to work through it and find solutions?" And when I asked myself that question, for me, it was always better to keep working through it and to find solutions. It would have been worse for my mental health to stop.
Mm.
I will say I gave myself breaks. I supplemented with formula sometimes. Sometimes I would stop and just pump for a while. So it wasn't complete, fully breastfeeding all the time with no breaks. Even from the very first latch, I had this very difficult birthing experience. I went in Friday morning and he was born Sunday evening.
Well,
Induction that I did not want to do, but it was a hospital policy that I needed to be inducted based on my gestational diabetes status. So I was inducted. He was finally born. And from the very first latch, I was in pain. And I really wanted to have this experience. He did do a breast crawl, which I don't know if you know what that is, but
mm-mm.
the baby will, if allowed to just lay on your tummy, they will move themselves even as an infant and find the breast. And so I really wanted uninterrupted skin to skin time to allow him to do that. And I had a midwife who was very protective of me trying to meet my goals despite my birth plan not going as I wanted it to go. And so we had a long time of uninterrupted skin to skin time. And then he did do the breast crawl, which I was so happy to get to experience, but it just always hurt and
Mm.
severe pain. And I had a doula, and she was trying to help me. And I saw the lactation consultant in the hospital. And I went back to her several times, and my mom was in town, and she wasn't trying to help me, like, physically latch, but she was taking care of cooking and laundry, and then I would call my husband Max in and try to get him to remember what did the lactation consultant say, and we were looking stuff up in the books and watching videos on YouTube, and I went back to the hospital lactation consultant a couple of times, and then I went and saw a private practice IBCLC, and she was lovely, and she helped me so much emotionally. He got diagnosed with a tongue tie, and he had 4 revisions, once at the pediatrician with scissors, once at an ENT at a children's hospital, once at a pediatric dentist with a laser, and then the final time was under general anesthesia at Yale University, where they actually sewed it to keep it from coming back, and that was when he was about I was already back at work, I think he was 5 or 6 months old by that time. And the pain just never went away. And we did cranial sacral therapy, which is a type of tissue massage to try to relax the facial muscles. And we did chiropractic care. And I probably saw an IBCLC, I don't know, 20 times. We went to a special breastfeeding clinic led by a doctor who was also an IBCLC, and she tried to provide extra support. It just never really resolved, and nobody could quite figure out why I was in so much pain.
Did you have people encouraging you to stop? Whether that be professionals, loved ones, all of the above.
I quickly learned who I could be honest with about my experiences. I did have some family members who would send me articles about formula feeding or newspaper articles about how outcomes for breastfeeding babies and formula feeding babies are the same. And those people just didn't get it, that I wasn't really concerned about that. For me, it was all about my own mental health and my desire to do this outweighed my bad experience. And I still to this day cannot explain why it was so important to me because I do not think that every person needs to make that decision. But it was so important to me to keep going.
That's one of my favorite things about you, just in general, is that you really do want what's best for the mother and for her. Like, you want it to be led by their decision making and their hopes and dreams, not being so affected by the voices around you. Because there's so many voices around you as a young mother of people trying to give you
Yes.
advice, tell you what to do, and you've got hormones raging inside you. And it's just, what voice do you listen to?
I know, it is so hard, and I just learned who I could open up to and really share my pain with and know that they were just gonna say, "This is really hard." And my lactation consultants were amazing. They helped me strike the balance, and they helped me to figure out, okay, when do I need to take a break and let my nipples heal up? When do I need to go easy on myself? Like when I went back to work, for instance, I was not producing enough milk for him. I know a lot more than I know now. So I was not using the correct franchises, for instance. So
Mm-hmm.
if I had been in the correct franchise for my pump, I probably would have produced a lot more than I did. But I did have to supplement with formula when I went back to work. And that was really hard at first. I did not want to give him formula. But in the end, I did, and you know what? He's fine, and I had lactation consultants who helped me come to that conclusion while recognizing my pain,
That's beautiful.
and it was that first private practice lactation consultant that I saw. It was maybe the second time I walked into her office, and it felt so safe just to go in there and cry and just say, "Why me? Why does it have to be so hard? I wanted this so badly." And it was that person who I asked, "How do I do this? How do I become an IBCLC?" And I knew that day, 9 years ago, that I was going to do it. She told me the requirements, and I heard them all, and I thought, "Oh my gosh, that's a lot of work." But I just started plugging away, and here I am 9 years
Look
later,
at you now.
Yeah, look at me now.
So then I want to know, going back to how just no one could figure out what was going on, with all of the information you have now, do you look back at that situation and kind of figure out why it was hurting, or do you still not understand?
I don't know. Yeah.
Mm.
And that's why when people contact me and they are really struggling, I never tell them I will 100% help them figure it out, but I tell them they won't feel alone
I love that.
because lactation is a really personal journey. And there is so much that we don't know. So we just can't guarantee that we're going to be able to help every person. But I will help you feel okay with where you land, and I can help you process your feelings about your adjustments.
Yes, because sometimes we need somewhere to go to complain, because sometimes you complain and then everyone's like, well, then just stop. But it's like, wait, I need to complain to get this off my chest and to feel validated and then be encouraged to keep going.
Human milk feeding isn't all or nothing. So sometimes you're told just stop, but what if there could be a middle ground? What if I could meet
Mm.
some of my goals, even if it's not all of my goals?
That's amazing. I love the middle ground.
Yeah.
Nowadays, everything is either black or white, but there's so much gray. And I love, you know me, I love the gray area because
Yeah.
there's so much more kindness and compassion. Okay, I want to go back and talk about something that you mentioned earlier and that you just, what's the word, insinuated. Your birth story, I feel like you have a lot of pain in that birth story, being not allowed to have followed your birth plan because of the way that the doctors forced you to follow their procedures and policies, which I love about your podcast is that you don't find in many podcasts about nursing, I'm guessing, because I don't really listen to them if I'm being honest, but you look at it through a lens of what the medical industry is doing wrong for us women who are breastfeeding. So how was that experience for you, and what do you have to say about all of that?
Yes. I was diagnosed with gestational diabetes in my pregnancy. I could not control it with food, no matter how strict I was. So then I had to go on insulin. I had to give myself insulin multiple times a day, which meant at the hospital I was giving birth at, I had to be induced. That was their policy. And I kept asking, "But I'm healthy, right?" And they kept saying, "Yes, you are healthy." And I kept saying, "And as far as we can tell, my baby's healthy, right?" And they kept saying, "Yes." And so then I kept saying, "So why do I have to be induced?" And their only answer was, "Because that's policy." They could not give me any other explanation. So I did everything I could to try to go into labor early. And every baby is different, and every person could have each baby they have at a different time, but with my daughter, with my second baby, I didn't go into labor until 41 weeks and 6 days. So, I'm probably a person who goes into labor on the later side and not the earlier side. So, my son was just not ready. So, I get induced, and we started with the lowest interventions possible. But with a lot of these interventions, you need to be on saline, so IVs of saline solution. And I swelled up a lot. And in fact, on my episode on your podcast was all about my identity as a Paralympian and as a disabled person. By the last day, I could not wear my prosthetic leg, which really impacted me in the first couple of weeks as a new parent because I could not wear it for a week or 2 weeks postpartum.
Therefore, you can't walk. So go get your baby or do the
Right.
mother things. Yeah. Oh
Yeah,
my
yeah.
gosh.
So I can walk without my prosthetic, but it's like a really big limp, and I'm a lot slower, I'm a lot less mobile. Like, I hate not wearing my prosthetic unless I'm just, like, in bed. So it was horrible. I couldn't wear it, and I swelled so much, and anyone who knows anything about baby feeding knows that when you have that much swelling, it can impact those initial feedings because your whole body swells, including your breast tissue. So it can make it hard for baby to latch initially. It can make it harder for your milk supply to come in. So there's a lot of impacts you can have in those first few days. Now, is that the thing that impacted my 3 years of difficult nursing? Probably not. But it definitely having that difficult birthing experience did not set me up for great baby feeding success, and it definitely made me more tired and made it more difficult for me to just be okay in those first 2 weeks as I was trying to learn the new skill of breastfeeding.
Yeah. All of that traumatic birth. That's days. That's too long.
Y Yeah.
And it didn't have to be because of the policy. That's amazing. So, how did your second child birthing and feeding go?
Yeah. So, first of all, we thought we were just going to have 1. My husband really just wanted 1, and I thought I was okay with that, and then I suddenly wasn't. Um, and so I talked him into having a second, and I think I'm so glad that I did because I love having 2 kids, and I know he loves having 2 kids
He
too.
has to.
Yeah, he has to, but I had definitely a redemptive birth experience, just a beautiful home birth. We had moved, and we were living in an apartment, and then when I was 40 weeks or 39 weeks, we closed on our house that we're living in now. But luckily, my home birth midwife, she was not concerned. She was like, "You are going to have this baby, and we will find a place for you to have this baby. And if that means you have the baby at my house, you'll have the baby at my house. If that means you have the baby in a hotel room, you'll have the baby in a hotel room. It does not concern
Oh
me
my
at all."
gosh.
Yeah. So it was nice to know that she wasn't, because we weren't really sure when you buy a house, you don't really know when you're gonna close. I was hoping we would get here. So it's special that that's one of the earliest memories in this house is having my baby here. So we did move in on time, and I will say that I was very worried about breastfeeding. If I had a hospital transfer and did not end up having the home birth, it would have been sad. It would have been disappointing. But if I had a repeat experience of having so much pain while breastfeeding and not being able to figure out why,
For 3
um,
years, I might add.
yeah,
Oh my gosh.
right. That would have crushed me because it really is rare to not be able to figure out the reason. Sometimes we figure out the reason and a family decides they don't wanna do something about it. If there is a tongue tie, sometimes families say, "I don't want to release the tie. I don't wanna put my baby through that." Or sometimes there's something else going on in the mouth. There's a high palate, or there could be other things happening. And so we can figure out the cause, and the family decides, I'm just going to switch to bottles. I think that's the best for our family. But just could not figure it out. And so I was so worried. And I was just talking to my husband about this recently, and he said he was not at all. He just thought it could not go any worse than that. And I was like, wow, that's a lot of confidence. A lot of confidence. And it could have gone worse because at least we weren't worried about my son's health. Like he was always gaining weight. It
That's
could always be
amazing.
worse if the baby's health is at stake.
It forced you to have to reconsider and probably stop. So that is like hindsight, it's a blessing, but during, I would never have said that to you during.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I was always aware of that too. I was so thankful that he was always gaining weight, but that was always a part of the mystery too, like, that he was able to transfer enough milk, yet I was in so much pain. I have my beautiful, amazing, redemptive home birth. I hemorrhaged pretty badly, but I had 3 amazing midwives at the house with me, and they were monitoring my hemoglobin levels, and it was not such that I needed a transfusion. So I was just really tired for a while after the birth. And she latched pretty quickly. I did have some initial pain, but it wasn't too bad. But I decided to go ahead and have a lactation consultant come out. I was already a certified lactation counselor at the time. I had already begun my lactation training. I was really involved with Breastfeeding USA. I do not think I was a volunteer yet, but I had been in their groups for a long time. Can't be your own gynecologist, you can't be your own
Mhm.
midwife, and you can't be your own lactation professional. And so I had a lactation consultant come to the house, Shelly Taft. She's been on my podcast and she told her personal stories. And she came 3 separate times. And she was pretty sure that Jolie also had a tongue tie. And so I went to a pediatric dentist and got it revised. And after that, it was pretty smooth sailing with her. I will say that the one thing that was a little difficult, by the time I had her, I was mostly at home with both kids. I did have a job that I went back to after about 12 weeks, just on the weekends and one evening, like one Saturday every other week and every Thursday. And she quickly just started refusing bottles. She just didn't like bottles. But it was so infrequent that it didn't really matter that much. We would just make up for it when I got together with her. So
Mhm.
that happened. Oh, and there was something that, and actually, this was the biggest thing that happened when she was a newborn. Here in Massachusetts, every newborn gets a newborn screening where they take a
Mhm.
blood test and send it off. And she got flagged for a rare genetic disorder called galactosemia. And this is a genetic disorder which has a lot of implications once the child gets older, often intellectual disabilities, infertility in females, and a shorter lifespan. But the big one that they have in infancy is they cannot metabolize any lactose, including that in human milk. And they will
Whoa.
die if they are fed human milk or any lactose. And so it was really serious when this came back, and I had been breastfeeding her for a few days. And so I was given a referral to maybe a metabolic doctor or a geneticist. And the first person I was given the referral for was just a jerk. I was concerned, of course, because when I Googled this, it looked very serious. And he said he could get us in 6 weeks. And until then, I must suspend all breastfeeding, of course, and feed Jolie soy formula. But 6 weeks sounded like such a long time to wait to be seen. These initial blood tests, the initial marker just comes up that it's a possibility. And so
Okay.
we weren't sure that she had it. We needed to do further testing. And so the plan was I was going to be pumping to maintain my milk supply until we knew whether or not she had it. But for anyone who has fed a baby with their body, you know that it's not just about the feeding. It's about the comforting. Anytime my babies cried, I would just try to breastfeed them, and often that helped them. And I know plenty of people who are able to comfort their babies without breastfeeding because they learn other tools. But for me, especially in early infancy, that was the tool I had. And I also had a 3.5-year-old. And at the time, I could not wrap my mind around for 6 weeks learning other tools. When that's how I helped my baby sleep. That's how I comforted my baby. That's how I helped her feel safe. That's how I fed her. And when I said to him, 6 weeks? You mean I have to stop breastfeeding my baby for 6 weeks until you can figure out if this is what she has? And he just so coldly said, "Do you want your baby to die?"
Oh my gosh.
And I was like, did you really just ask me that? No, I don't want my baby to die. What person wants their baby to die? I just could not believe.
No, what I want you to do is do your freaking job faster. Well,
Yeah. And he wasn't recognizing the difficulty of suspending breastfeeding for that long until she could be further tested. And mind you, typically when an infant has galactosemia and they have lactose buildup in their body for 3 days from breastfeeding, they are showing signs of failure to thrive. But she was not showing this, nor did he ask me
and how long had
what
she
her
been?
disposition was. She had
Yeah,
been
and how
feeding for
long?
3 days at this
Yeah.
point.
Oh my
And
gosh.
yeah. So, I did not hire this doctor, and I think this is a good reminder that we hire doctors. We have a choice. And I found somebody else at Boston Children's, and I called her, and it was a Friday. And I explained the situation. I explained what the other doctor had said to me, and she said, "I can get you in for the initial testing on Monday, but I do want to get my eyes on your daughter before you feed her any more breast milk. Do you think you could suspend breastfeeding for the weekend, feed her soy formula, and then after I see her and after we do the initial blood test, I can tell you whether or not it is safe to continue breastfeeding?" And because I am a reasonable person who loves my daughter, I said, "Of course, I will suspend breastfeeding for the weekend and I will feed her soy formula and I will see you on Monday."
But just the stance of how she said that was like so much more loving and compassionate. Do you think this is an okay idea instead of do this, see you in 6 weeks?
Exactly. And she understood. She was like, I understand you're the mom of a newborn. I understand this is hard for you, but I really would like to see her first. And I understood that. You want to do your job. You want to get a look at my daughter and see what she looks like. And I went in, she saw her, and almost immediately she was like, you know what? Your daughter looks great. You were feeding her for 3 days. I'm pretty sure you're going to be able to feed her today before you leave breast milk, but let me just do this blood test. And it turns out she is a carrier of galactosemia. So if she were to partner with somebody and have children with somebody who was also a carrier, then they could pass it down to their child. So there was more testing that we could have done, but we decided that we would let her make that decision as she gets older, if she would like to do that.
That is beautiful. What is the best advice that you can give? Because I know that you can go in and you can help people individually, but just like a blanket statement, best advice you could give.
Tune into your baby. Your baby can tell you what you need to do. And if you spend your time figuring out your baby's cues and your baby's signals, you will learn so much more than asking on the Facebook groups, than following the Instagram accounts. And I love those Instagram accounts. And I answer questions in the Facebook groups. But your baby will tell you what your baby needs. Your baby will tell you about your supply. Your baby will tell you if your baby's hungry or if your baby isn't hungry. And we have all these guidelines like feed your baby every 2 to 3 hours, or don't go any longer than 5 hours without feeding your baby, or your baby should have X number of pees and poops in a day, depending on their age. But these guidelines are based on averages. And your baby is not an average. Your baby is an individual. And so your baby might feed every 45 minutes, or your baby might feed every 5 hours. It really is dependent on the storage capacity of your body and on your baby's needs at any given time. So if you really spend your time getting to know your baby, then you won't have to compare your baby to the averages or to what Ollie's doing on Facebook. You'll just know what your baby needs.
Drop the mic. That was beautiful. As a podcaster and a friend and a listener, on behalf of your audience, thank you so much for what you're doing, because there's not enough support for women out there in sticking up for yourself against people who think that they're smarter than you. And this voice of listen to your baby, listen to your body, and compassion. I'm very passionate about compassion and kindness and knowing there's not one right way to do everything. Just thank you for all the hard work and everything you put into your podcast and your Instagrams and just everything. You are loved and you're helping so many women. And I see you and I love you. And thank you for doing 100 episodes. And here's to 100 more.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chelsea. Thank you for hosting today and for being a person who I felt I could trust with my story for this 100th episode.
Oh, always. I love you. I have your back.
Awesome. Thank you. So that's it for my story and the 100th episode. I'm so thankful for Chelsea, who took time out of her busy schedule as a mother of 2 and a podcaster to record my stories with me. All the episodes that you heard mentioned will be linked in the show notes so that if you want to check any of them out, you can. And I strongly encourage you to check out Chelsea's show, Beyond the Picket Fence. It's a beautiful show which encourages people to remember that none of us know what is happening in the lives of other people that we encounter. She has so many amazing guests who get vulnerable and share their stories. And I'll have my episode on her show linked, of course. And actually, I talked nothing about breastfeeding. And if anyone wants a little bonus content from this episode in video format, you can join my Milk Making Minutes community group, where there's 6 minutes of bonus content in which Chelsea asks me about what it was like nursing older children and how I handled that. So join the Milk Making Minutes community group to have access to that.